Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the Earth vessel Horizon as it cruised through the dark edges of the Andromeda sector. His crew had been on patrol for 3 weeks now, and the routine was beginning to wear on everyone. The stars outside looked the same as they always did, and nothing interesting had happened since they left port. Jake was reviewing supply reports when his communications officer suddenly spoke up. "Lieutenant." Sophie Blake turned from her station with a confused expression on her face. She pressed her earpiece closer and listened intently before speaking. "The signal we are picking up is definitely human, but it is scrambled badly. It sounds like a distress call, but I cannot make out the words clearly." She worked her console for another moment and then looked at Jake with concern. "Sir, it is coming from that Krellian research station orbiting the third moon in this system." Jake felt his stomach tighten at the mention of the Krellians. The insectoid species had joined the Galactic Council 2 centuries before humanity. They were known throughout the galaxy for their scientific achievements. They were also known for being cold and calculating in their approach to research. What would a human distress signal be doing at one of their stations? He ordered Sophie to trace the signal, get them closer to the station. The Horizon moved through space silently as it approached the research facility. The station was not large, but it bristled with sensors and communication arrays. Jake could see several Krellian ships docked at various ports, but no human vessels anywhere nearby. He called his security chief to the bridge and began planning a boarding operation. Something felt very wrong about this situation, in every instinct. He was screaming at him to be careful. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Shaw arrived on the bridge within minutes and listened as Jake explained what they had found. Ryan was a veteran of the border conflicts with pirate groups, and he knew how to handle dangerous situations. He suggested taking a full squad of Marines, along with medical personnel, just in case they found injured humans. Jake agreed and gave the order to prepare for boarding. Sophie managed to clean up the signal enough to hear fragments of words. The voice was young and frightened. "Please help us. They keep taking us one at a time. It hurts so much. Please, someone find us." The transmission cut off abruptly and did not resume. Sophie tried to hail the station directly, but received only automated responses about the facility being engaged and classified. Jake made his decision quickly. He ordered Ryan to take the boarding team and investigate the source of that transmission. If there were humans in trouble on that station, then they were going to get them out. The Horizon moved closer and deployed a boarding shuttle. Ryan led 12 Marines and 2 medical officers toward the Krellian station while Jake watched from the bridge. The Krellian station master responded to their approach with irritation. He stated that the facility was engaged in private research, and that unauthorized boarding would be considered a hostile act. Jake informed him coldly that they had received a human distress call from inside his station, and they would be investigating whether he liked it or not. The station master began to protest, but Jake cut the transmission and told Ryan to proceed. Ryan and his team docked with the station and cut through the airlock when the Krellians refused to open it. They entered the facility with weapons ready and immediately noticed how quiet everything was. The corridors were clean and sterile with bright white lights everywhere. They followed Sophie's tracking signal deeper into the station past laboratories filled with strange equipment. They encountered the first Krellian scientist in a junction between corridors. The tall, insect-like being clicked its mandibles in what might have been surprise or annoyance. Ryan demanded to know where the humans were, and the scientist replied that there were no unauthorized personnel on the station. Ryan did not believe him and pushed past while his Marines kept their weapons trained on the Krellian. The tracking signal led them to a secured section of the station. Ryan could see reinforced doors with electronic locks and warning signs in multiple languages. He ordered one of his Marines to override the locks while the others covered the corridor. The doors opened with a hiss, and what Ryan saw inside made his blood turn to ice. Behind reinforced energy barriers were containment cells. Inside those cells were children, human children. Ryan counted 12 of them, ranging from small kids who looked about 6 years old to teenagers. They were wearing plain gray clothing, and many of them had visible bruises and medical bandages. Several were crying, while others just stared at the Marines with empty expressions. Sophie Blake had accompanied the boarding team against regulations because she wanted to see what was happening firsthand. When she saw the children, she felt rage unlike anything she had experienced before. She immediately began working to disable the energy barriers, while Ryan called for the medical officers. The children flinched away when the barriers dropped, but Sophie spoke softly to them and promised they were there to help. The medical officers moved from cell to cell, checking each child. What they found was horrifying. The children showed signs of repeated medical procedures and experiments. Some had injection marks covering their arms, while others had surgical scars. They were all malnourished and dehydrated. One little girl, no older than 7, clutched a torn piece of fabric like it was the most precious thing in the world. Ryan demanded answers from the Krellian scientists who had gathered in the corridor outside. The lead researcher explained calmly that these were purchased specimens acquired legally through intermediaries. They were studying human physiology and psychological responses to various stimuli. The children had been taken from different colony worlds over the past several months. The scientists seemed genuinely confused about why the Marines were so upset. Sophie had to physically restrain Ryan from attacking the Krellian researcher. She reminded him through gritted teeth that they needed to get the children to safety first. Ryan agreed reluctantly and ordered his team to gather the kids and get them back to the horizon. The medical officers wrapped the children in thermal blankets and carried the smallest ones, while the older kids walked on shaky legs. Jake watched from the bridge as the boarding team returned with the children. His hands gripped the armrests of his command chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When Ryan reported what they had found, Jake felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. These were children. Human children who had been stolen from their homes and tortured in the name of science. He ordered the Krellian researchers placed under arrest and confined to secure quarters on the horizon. The station master protested loudly and threatened to report this incident to the Galactic Council. Jake told him to go ahead and make that report because he was about to do the same thing. He then ordered Sophie to compile every piece of evidence they could find and prepare a full transmission to Earth Command. The children were taken to the medical bay, where doctors began treating their injuries. Sophie stayed with them and tried to keep them calm. One boy, who looked about 12, asked her if they were really safe now, or if this was another test. Sophie felt tears in her eyes as she promised him that they were going home. She told all the children that no one would ever hurt them again. Jake sent his report to Earth Command along with medical scans, visual evidence, and recordings of the Krellian researchers explaining their experiments. He knew this transmission would cause an uproar, but he did not care. These children deserved justice, and he was going to make sure they got it. As the horizon set course back to human space, Jake looked at the stars outside and wondered how many other atrocities were hidden out there in the darkness. The news reached Earth within hours and spread across human space like a wildfire burning through dry grass. Every news channel broadcast the images that Jake Morrison had sent back from the Krellian research station. People saw the frightened faces of children who had been missing for months. They saw the medical scans showing evidence of repeated experiments and procedures. They saw the cold, sterile cells where kids had been kept like laboratory animals. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted on every human colony, world, and station. Thousands of people gathered outside Galactic Council embassy buildings demanding action. Some protests remained peaceful, but others turned violent as angry crowds threw rocks and set fires. On Mars Colony, a group of protesters broke into a Krellian trade office and destroyed everything inside before security forces could stop them. 3 Krellian merchants were injured in the incident and had to be evacuated under military protection. Patricia Hughes was Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council, and she had served in that position for 5 years. She was known as a careful diplomat who chose her words wisely and tried to find compromise solutions to problems. But when she saw the images of those children, something inside her changed. She immediately demanded an emergency session of the Galactic Council to address what she called an act of war against humanity. The Galactic Council convened 3 days later on Unity Prime, which was a massive space station that served as neutral ground for all member species. The council chamber was enormous, with seating areas arranged in a circle around a central platform. 17 different species had reprison. Tatives there, and each one had their own customs and ways of doing things. The chamber could hold thousands of observers in the galleries. Above, Patricia walked to the central platform wearing a simple black suit. She carried a data tablet containing all the evidence that the Horizon had gathered. The galleries were packed with representatives from dozens of species who had come to watch the proceedings. She could feel their eyes on her as she prepared to speak. Some looked curious, while others seemed hostile or dismissive. The council chairman was a being called Tall Varan, who belonged to a species that looked somewhat like tall gray mushrooms. His voice echoed through the chamber as he called the session to order. He acknowledged that humanity had requested this emergency meeting and invited Patricia to present her case. She took a deep breath and began. Patricia displayed the images on the large screens that ringed the chamber. She showed the children in their cells. She showed the medical evidence of what had been done to them. She played audio recordings of Krellian scientists, casually discussing their experiments as if they were talking about plants or insects. Her voice remained steady and professional, but everyone could hear the anger beneath her words. She explained that 12 human children had been kidnapped. From their homes on various colony worlds, their families had been told they were missing or dead. In reality, they had been sold to Krellian researchers who wanted to study human biology. The children had been subjected to painful procedures and kept in isolation for months. Some were so traumatized they could barely speak. Patricia demanded that the council condemn these actions and punish those responsible. The Krellian representative stood to respond. Ambassador Zeltok was tall, even for his species, with a dark exoskeleton that gleamed under the chamber lights. His compound eyes reflected no emotion as he clicked his mandibles together. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that made Patricia want to scream. Zeltok explained that the researchers had acted within established legal frameworks. He pointed to Section 47 of the Acquisition Protocols, which governed how specimens could be obtained for scientific research. According to that section, any species that had not been formally recognized as fully sentient by the Council could be acquired through licensed intermediaries for research purposes. Since humanity had only joined the Council 30 years ago, there was a question about their full sentient status under the old protocols. The chamber erupted in noise. Some species representatives shouted in anger, while others argued about legal technicalities. Patricia stood frozen on the platform, unable to believe what she had just heard. The Krellians were claiming that human children were legal research subjects because of an outdated bureaucratic rule. She felt her hands shaking as rage flooded through her. She raised her voice above the chaos and asked the question that silenced the entire chamber. Are you telling me that because humanity is new to this council, our children are fair game for your experiments? Is that what you are saying to me right now? Her voice was cold and sharp like broken glass. Zeltok replied that the legal situation was complicated, but essentially yes. Under current protocols, species with less than 50 years of council, membership did not have full protection under certain research regulations. He added that the Krellian government had paid substantial fees to the intermediaries, who provided the specimens, so there was no theft involved. The children had been acquired legally according to council law. Several species representatives stood and began shouting. A delegate from the Valorian Empire demanded to know how such an archaic law was still in effect. A representative from the Torkin Confederation argued that the law had always been intended for non-sapient animals, not for children of council member species. Others defended the law, saying that changing it would set dangerous precedents. The debate raged for hours. Patricia sat in the human delegation area and watched as the council argued about legal technicalities while 12 traumatized children were recovering in hospitals back on Earth. She realized with growing horror that the council might not do anything at all. Many species saw humanity as newcomers who needed to learn their place. Others were afraid of what changing the law might mean for their own research programs. The council chairman finally called for a vote on whether to condemn the Krellian actions. The result was mixed. 7 species voted for condemnation. 6 voted against, for abstained. The measure failed to reach the required majority. The chairman then proposed forming an investigative committee to study the matter and make recommendations. That motion passed easily because it meant doing nothing immediately. Patricia stood and walked out of the chamber before the session ended. She could not bear to listen to any more debate. In the corridor outside, she found Jake Morrison waiting for her. He had been promoted to admiral and given command of a battle group after his rescue of the children. His uniform was crisp, and his expression was hard. Jake asked her what the council had decided. Patricia told him they were forming a committee to investigate. The process could take years. Meanwhile, the Krellians would face no immediate consequences. The children would get no justice. The families would get no answers about how this had been allowed to happen. Jake nodded slowly, as if he had expected this outcome. He told Patricia that he had watched the proceedings from the observation gallery. He had seen how the council valued their laws and procedures more than they valued the lives of children. He said he had also been in contact with Earth Command. They had been discussing options. Patricia looked at him and saw something dangerous in his eyes. She asked him what kind of options. Jake explained that Earth was done asking permission from the council. If the Krellians thought they could hide behind legal technicalities, then humanity would show them what happened when you hurt
out their children.
He said the fleet was already moving into position. She grabbed his arm and asked if he meant war. Jake replied that he meant justice. Earth had issued an ultimatum to the Krellian government. All their vessels and personnel had 72 hours to evacuate human space. Any research involving human subjects was to be terminated immediately. The Krellians would pay reparations to the families and submit to independent investigations. If they refused, then humanity would take action. Patricia felt her heart racing. She asked what kind of action. Jake told her that Admiral Lisa Garrett was taking the Third Fleet to the Krellian homeworld. 50 warships would blockade their planet until they complied. Other human fleets would secure every known Krellian research station in documented space. No shots would be fired unless the Krellians started shooting first, but the message would be clear. She asked if Earth's command understood. This could start a war with half the galaxy. Jake looked at her and said something that she would never forget. He told her that those were children in those cells. Human children who had been stolen and tortured. If the council would not deliver justice, then humanity would do it themselves. He said he would rather fight the entire galaxy than let this stand. Patricia watched him walk away and felt something shift. She had spent years trying to make humanity respected in the council through diplomacy and patience. But maybe Jake was right. Maybe some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. She took out her communicator and sent a message to Earth Command. She told them she supported the ultimatum and would resign her position if ordered to back down. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity was capable of when their children were threatened. The 72-hour deadline began counting down the moment Earth Command broadcast the ultimatum across every communication channel in the galaxy. Every species heard the message in their own language. Every government received a formal diplomatic notice. Humanity was done negotiating and done waiting for committees to discuss things. The Krellian government had 3 days to comply or face the consequences. Admiral Lisa Garrett stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Constitution, as the Third Fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel. 50 warships materialized in perfect formation around the Krellian homeworld. The planet below was covered in gleaming cities and research complexes that housed billions of Krellians. Lisa had spent 20 years in the fleet and commanded ships in border skirmishes and anti-piracy operations, but this was different. This was a blockade of a council member world, and it could start a war that would consume the galaxy. She opened a channel to the Krellian, the defense fleet that was scrambling. To respond to the sudden appearance of human warships, her message was simple and direct. The Third Fleet was here to enforce Earth's ultimatum. No Krellian vessel would be allowed to leave orbit until their government agreed to the terms. Any ship that tried to run the blockade would be stopped. She recommended they power down their weapons and wait for their leaders to make the right decision. The Krellian defense commander responded with outrage and threats. He stated that this was an act of war and that the council would punish humanity for this aggression. Lisa cut him off and reminded him that his people had tortured human children. She told him that if he wanted to start shooting over that, then he should go ahead, but he would lose. The Krellian ships held their positions but did not stand down. Meanwhile, other human fleets were moving into position around every documented Krell. In research facility in known space, Admiral Jake Morrison led a task force to a massive research complex in the Outer Rim. The complex was actually a cluster of 15 different stations, all connected by transport tubes and docking ports. It was one of the largest Krellian scientific facilities outside their home system. Jake sent boarding teams to each station simultaneously. The Marines moved through corridors and laboratories with weapons ready and recording equipment running. What they found made the situation with the children look like just the beginning. The Krellians had been conducting experiments on dozens of different species for decades. Most were animals, but some were clearly intelligent beings from worlds that had not yet achieved space travel. One station held creatures that looked like small, furry mammals with large eyes and delicate hands. They communicated through musical sounds and showed obvious signs of tool use and social bonding. The Krellian researchers had been testing their pain tolerance and studying how they reacted to various toxins. Another station held beings that resembled floating jellyfish with bioluminescent patterns. They were being dissected alive to study their unusual biology. Jake ordered everything recorded and broadcast immediately. He wanted the galaxy to see what the Krellians had been doing while hiding behind council regulations. The images went out on every channel and could not be blocked or censored. Species across the galaxy watched in horror as the evidence piled up. The Krellians were not just experimenting on humans. They were running what amounted to torture facilities for any creature they could legally acquire. The Galactic Council went into emergency session again. The chamber was in chaos as representatives shouted at each other and demanded answers. The Krellian ambassador tried to explain that all research had been conducted legally, but his words were drowned out by the uproar. 3 species withdrew their delegations and walked out in protest. They stated that they could not be part of a council that allowed such atrocities. Patricia Hughes spoke from the central platform again. But this time her tone was different. She was not asking for justice anymore. She was telling the council what humanity was going to do. Every Krellian research facility would be seized and shut down. Every subject would be freed and returned home if possible. The Krellian government would pay massive reparations, not just to humanity, but to every species that had suffered. If the council tried to stop this, then humanity would withdraw from the council and consider any interference an act of war. The council chairman tried to restore order, but it was impossible. More species were standing and announcing their support for humanity's actions. Others were condemning the blockade as illegal aggression. The Valorian Empire delegates stood and called for a vote on temporary suspension of the research protocols while a full investigation was conducted. The motion passed with a slim majority after hours of heated debate. Back at the Krellian homeworld, the standoff continued. Lisa watched her tactical displays as Krellian ships moved around, trying to find weaknesses in the blockade formation. Her fleet maintained perfect positioning and denied them any openings. Several civilian ships tried to make a run for it and were stopped by warning shots across their bows. The civilian vessels turned back and returned to orbit. On Earth, the public watched everything unfold in real time. Support for the military action was overwhelming. People gathered in public squares to watch the news broadcasts and cheer when another research facility was seized. The families of the 12 rescued children appeared at rallies and spoke about their ordeal. One mother named Karen Phillips held up a picture of her 8-year-old son and told the crowd that she had thought he was dead. Now he was recovering in a hospital, and she wanted every person responsible to face justice. The Krellian government held emergency meetings trying to decide how to respond. Their economy was already suffering from the blockade. Trade ships could not leave, and supply vessels could not enter. Their research programs were being dismantled across the galaxy. Several allied species were quietly distancing themselves rather than get caught up in the growing storm. The Krellian leadership realized they had badly miscalculated how humanity would react. On the second day of the blockade, something unexpected happened. A message came through from the Valorian Empire addressed directly to Earth Command. The Valorians were offering their support for humanity's actions. They would not join the blockade, but they would use their influence in the council to pressure the Krellians to comply. They also revealed something that shocked everyone. The Valorians themselves had lost children to similar research programs 300 years ago before they became powerful. They understood humanity's rage because they had felt it themselves. More messages followed from other species. Some offered diplomatic support, while others provided intelligence about additional Krellian facilities that had not been documented. A species called the Zenthari sent coordinates for a hidden research station in an uncharted system. When Jake's forces investigated, they found more victims, including several Zenthari, who had been missing for years. The evidence kept mounting, and the galaxy's opinion turned sharply against the Krellians. Patricia received a private communication from Ambassador Zeltok requesting a meeting. She agreed, but insisted it be recorded and made public. They met in a conference room on Unity Prime, with observers from a dozen species watching. Zeltok looked different than he had in the council chamber. His posture was slumped, and his mandibles twitched nervously. He told Patricia that his government was prepared to negotiate. They had not understood the depth of human feeling about their young. They had viewed the research as purely scientific, and had not considered the emotional and ethical implications. He claimed they were willing to shut down the programs and provide compensation. Patricia listened to his words and felt nothing but contempt. She told him that humanity was not interested in negotiations anymore. The terms were non-negotiable. Every facility shut down immediately. Every research subject freed. Full access for independent investigators. Reparations paid to every victim and their families. Criminal charges filed against every researcher involved. The Krellians would accept all of this, or the blockade would continue indefinitely. She asked him if he understood. Zeltok said the terms were harsh and would damage Krellian society for generations. Patricia leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was cold as ice. She told him about a little girl named Emma, who was 7 years old. Emma had been taken from her home on a farming colony and spent 4 months in a Krellian lab. They had injected her with compounds to study human immune response. She developed infections and fevers and cried for her mother every night. Patricia said Emma was still in the hospital and might never fully recover. She asked Zeltok if he thought the terms were too harsh compared to what Emma had endured. The Krellian ambassador had no response. Patricia stood and walked out, leaving him sitting alone. The recording of their meeting was broadcast across the galaxy within the hour. Public opinion shifted even further against the Krellians. Even species that had initially condemned humanity's blockade began to quietly express understanding for their actions. On the third day, just hours before the deadline expired, the Krellian government sent an official response. They agreed to all terms without reservation. The research programs would end. The facilities would be open to investigators. Reparations would be paid. Lisa received the message on the bridge of the Constitution and verified it with Earth Command before ordering her fleet to stand down. The blockade was over, but the warships would remain in position until compliance was verified. Jake Morrison and his task forces began the process of shutting down the research facilities properly. Medical teams arrived to care for the victims. Diplomats worked to identify beings and arrange their return home. It was a massive undertaking that would take months to complete, but it had started. Humanity had forced the issue and won. The standoff had lasted 2 weeks, and the tension across the galaxy was reaching a breaking point. Human fleets remained stationed around Krellian facilities, even after the government had agreed to the terms. Earth Command wanted to verify compliance before withdrawing any forces. The Krellians were cooperating, but slowly and with obvious reluctance. Every day brought new discoveries of hidden research programs and unreported facilities. The scope of what had been happening was far larger than anyone had initially realized. Admiral Jake Morrison spent his days overseeing the dismantling of research stations, and his nights reviewing reports that made him sick to his stomach. One facility had been breeding intelligent species in captivity for 3 generations just to have a steady supply of test subjects. Another had been studying how different species reacted to psychological torture. The Krellians had kept meticulous records of everything they did, which made the evidence undeniable, but also made it harder to read. On Unity Prime, the Galactic Council was fracturing under the pressure. Several more species had withdrawn their delegations in protest. Others were threatening to leave if the Council did not take stronger action. The remaining members were divided between those who supported humanity and those who feared the precedent being set. No one could remember a time when a single inside ent had caused so much chaos in galactic politics. Ambassador Patricia Hughes was in her office reviewing proposals for new legislation when her assistant informed her that Ambassador Kira Bell of the Valorian Empire had requested an urgent meeting. Patricia agreed immediately. The Valorians were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the Council. They had remained mostly neutral during the crisis, while quietly supporting humanity behind the scenes. If Kira wanted to meet, then something important was happening. Kira Bell arrived an hour later. She was tall and elegant, with pale blue skin and silver hair that flowed like water. Her species aged very slowly, and Kira had been a diplomat for over 2 centuries. She had a reputation for being brilliant and utterly uncompromising when it came to matters of principle. Patricia offered her a seat and tea, which Kira accepted with a graceful nod. They made small talk for a few minutes before Kira got to the point. She told Patricia that she had been authorized by the Valorian High Council to break a silence that had lasted for 300 years. Her government was going to reveal something at the next council session that would change everything. She wanted Patricia to be prepared for what was coming. Patricia set down her tea and listened carefully. Kira explained that the Valorians had not always been powerful. Centuries ago, they had been a younger species newly admitted to the Council. Back then, different species held power, and the laws were written to benefit them. The Valorians had discovered that some of their children had gone missing from remote colonies. They searched for years before finding the truth. Their children had been taken by research programs, just like what happened to humanity. Patricia felt her breath catch. She asked how many children. Kira's expression became pained, and she said, over 400 across a span of 20 years. The Valorians had demanded justice from the Council, but were told the acquisitions were legal under the protocols. The species responsible were powerful and well-connected. The Valorians were still weak and had no leverage. So they did the only thing they could do. They became strong. Over the next century, the Valorians built their empire through trade, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. They became wealthy and powerful enough that no one could ignore them. They pushed for changes to council laws and gradually made conditions better for younger species. But they never spoke publicly about what had happened to their children. The shame and pain were too great. They buried it under layers of political success and tried to forget. Kira told Patricia that watching humanity's response had awakened something in the Valorian leadership. They saw their own ancient rage reflected in human actions. They realized they had become part of the system they once fought against. By staying silent about their own tragedy, they had enabled others to suffer. It was time to break that silence and face the truth, no matter how painful. The next council session was scheduled for the following day. Patricia took her seat in the human delegation area, wondering what Kira was going to say. The galleries were packed with observers. Every species wanted to see what would happen next. The tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut with a knife. The council chairman called the session to order and began with routine business. Then Kira Bell stood and requested permission to address the council on a matter of historical importance. The chairman looked surprised but granted permission. Kira walked to the central platform and stood there for a long moment looking at the assembled representatives. She began by saying that the Valorian Empire had a confession to make. For 300 years they had kept a shameful secret. She then told the story of the missing children and the research programs and the council's refusal to help. Her voice was steady, but everyone could hear the emotion beneath her words. She displayed images and records that the Valorians had kept all those years. Evidence of atrocities committed against children who had done nothing wrong. The chamber fell silent as Kira continued. She explained that the Valorians had chosen to gain power rather than seek immediate justice. They had climbed the ranks of council influence, while never speaking about what drove them. In doing so, they had allowed the same laws and systems to remain in place. Other species had suffered because the Valorians chose silence over truth. Kira's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She said that watching humanity refuse to be silent had shamed the Valorian leadership. Humans had been on the council for only 30 years, but they were willing to risk everything for their children. The Valorians had 2 centuries of power and influence, but had done nothing to prevent others from suffering as they had. That ended now. She announced that the Valorian Empire was formally supporting humanity's call for complete reform of the Council's research protocols. They would use all their political influence to push through new laws, protecting all sapient beings regardless of Council membership status. They would provide funding for an independent oversight body with real authority. They would open their own historical records to investigators who wanted to study what had happened. The age of looking away from atrocities in the name of legal technicalities was over. The chamber erupted. Representatives shouted questions and demands. Some species applauded, while others protested. Kira stood calmly in the center of it all and waited for the chaos to settle. When the chairman finally restored order, several other species requested the floor. One by one, they stood and made similar confessions. A species called the Rothani revealed they had lost colony ships to pirate attacks that turned out to be disguised research vessels. The Zinthari admitted they had known about illegal research programs targeting primitive species, but had said nothing because they benefited from the results. A small species called the Miran told of how their entire species had nearly been wiped out by experiments before they achieved space travel. Story after story came out as species finally broke their silence. Patricia sat in shock as the truth poured out. The council had been built on a foundation of ignored suffering. The powerful species had created laws that protected themselves while allowing the exploitation of others. Everyone knew it was happening, but no one wanted to speak up because that might threaten their own position. Humanity had broken that cycle by refusing to be quiet. Jake Morrison watched the session from the observation gallery. He sat next to Ryan Shaw, who had been with him since the beginning. Ryan leaned over and asked if Jake had expected this. Jake shook his head and admitted he thought they would be fighting alone. He never imagined that speaking up would cause so many others to find their voice. The council session lasted for 8 hours. By the end, 17 different species had shared stories of suffering under the old protocols. The chairman looked exhausted as he called for a vote on emergency reform measures. The proposal would suspend all research programs pending review. It would establish new standards for determining sapient rights. It would create an independent body to investigate past violations. Most importantly, it would establish that any species capable of complex communication and emotional bonding was protected regardless of council membership. The vote was overwhelming. 22 species voted in favor. 3 voted against. 2 abstained. The measure passed, and the council erupted in applause. Patricia felt tears running down her face. They had done it. Not just for humanity, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. Kira found Patricia after the session ended. The 2 women embraced, and Kira thanked her for having the courage to fight. Patricia told her that Kira's speech had changed everything. By admitting their own pain, the Valorians had given permission for others to do the same. Kira smiled sadly and said it should have happened centuries ago, but better late than never. News of the council vote spread quickly. On Earth, people celebrated in the streets. The families of the rescued children watched the broadcasts and wept with relief. Their trauma had not been meaningless. It had sparked a change that would protect countless others. One father, named Greg Harrison, told reporters that his daughter Linda would carry scars for the rest of her life, but at least she could know that her suffering had purpose. Jake received orders to begin the transition process. Human forces would remain in place for another month while the new oversight body was established. Then they would gradually withdraw as independent investigators took over. The Krellians would face criminal trials for the researchers involved. Other species would conduct their own investigations into programs that had targeted them. It was the beginning of real accountability. Patricia stood on an observation deck looking out at the stars. She thought about how close they had come to war. How many people had been ready to fight and die over this? But somehow speaking the truth had been more powerful than any weapon. The galaxy would never be the same. 6 months had passed since the crisis began. The galaxy was still adjusting to the changes that had swept through it like a storm. The Galactic Council had transformed from a body that protected the powerful into one that actually tried to enforce justice for all species. The new Sentience Protection Accord had been signed by 43 species, with more joining every week. Those who refused to sign found themselves isolated as trade partners and allies. Quietly distanced themselves, the 12 rescued children were finally going home. They had spent months in specialized medical facilities on Earth receiving treatment for their physical and psychological trauma. Teams of doctors and therapists worked with them every day, helping them process what had happened and learn to feel safe again. Progress was slow and painful, but it was happening. Some children recovered faster than others, but all of them were healing. Captain Sophie. Blake stood in the shuttle bay of Unity Prime, watching as the children prepared to board transports that would take them back to their families. She had stayed close to them throughout their recovery because she had been there when they were freed. The children trusted her in a way they did not trust most adults. She had made them a promise that day on the Krellian station, and she intended to keep it. A little girl named Emma, who was 8 years old, walked up to Sophie and hugged her tightly. Emma had been one of the most traumatized children, with nightmares every night and a fear of anyone in a white coat. But she had made remarkable progress over the past months. She asked Sophie if bad people would ever take her again. Sophie knelt down and looked Emma in the eyes. She promised that humanity would never let that happen to her or any other child ever again. The children boarded their transports, and Sophie watched them leave with tears in her eyes. She had been promoted to commander after the rescue operation, but the rank meant nothing compared to seeing those kids smile again. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Shaw found her standing there and put a hand on her shoulder. He told her she had done good work. Sophie nodded, but said the real work was just beginning. She had spent the past months putting together a proposal for something she called the Guardian Initiative. It would be a volunteer organization dedicated to investigating missing persons cases across human space and beyond. The goal was to make sure no child or vulnerable person disappeared without someone looking for them. Ryan had agreed to help her establish it, and they already had thousands of applications from people who wanted to join. Admiral Jake Morrison was on Earth meeting with military leadership about the future. The crisis had revealed weaknesses in humanity's intelligence-gathering capabilities. They had not known about the Krellian research programs until it was almost too late. The Admiralty wanted to establish better monitoring of Council activities and increase fleet presence in border regions. Jake supported the plans but warned against becoming paranoid or aggressive. He walked through the halls of military headquarters and thought about how much had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a captain on routine patrol. Now he was an admiral and something of a hero to the public. People recognized him on the street and wanted to shake his hand. He found the attention uncomfortable because he had just done what anyone would do. Those were children in cages. The choice to act had been obvious. Jake met with Admiral Lisa Garrett, who had commanded the blockade of the Krellian homeworld. She told him the Krellian government was complying with all terms of the agreement, but their society was struggling. The economy had crashed when the blockade cut off trade. Their reputation was destroyed, and other species refused to work with them. Lisa said some analysts worried the Krellians might collapse entirely. Jake asked if she felt sympathy for them. Lisa was quiet for a moment before answering. She said she felt sympathy for ordinary Krellians who had not known what their government was doing. But for the leadership and the researchers, she felt nothing but contempt. They had built their scientific advancement on the suffering of innocents. If their society collapsed under the weight of that truth, then maybe it deserved to collapse. On Unity Prime, Ambassador Patricia Hughes was attending the first meeting of the newest Sentience Protection Council. The body consisted of representatives from 15 different species, all chosen for their commitment to protecting vulnerable beings. Their authority was real, with the power to investigate any facility and shut down programs that violated the new protocols. Patricia had been asked to serve as the human representative, and she had accepted. The first case they reviewed involved a species called the Dalvori, who had been conducting experiments on creatures from their own planet. The creatures were intelligent enough to use tools and communicate, but the Dalvor classified them as animals because they had not developed technology. The Protection Council ruled that the creatures met the criteria for sapient beings and ordered all research stopped. The Dalvori government protested but ultimately complied when threatened with sanctions. Patricia realized this was going to be the pattern going forward. Species would test the limits of the new rules, and the Protection Council would have to enforce them. It would be exhausting work with constant battles and resistance. But it was necessary work. She thought about Emma and the other children, and knew that every fight was worth it if it prevented even one person from suffering as they had. Ambassador Kirvel visited Patricia in her office one evening. The Valorian brought a bottle of wine from her homeworld, and the two women sat together talking about the past months. Kira admitted that revealing her species' history had been harder than she expected. The Valorian public had reacted with shock and anger that their government had kept such secrets. There had been protests and calls for leadership changes. But there had also been a sense of relief that the truth was finally known. Patricia asked if Kira regretted speaking out. Kira shook her head firmly and said it was the best decision she had ever made. Living with secrets had poisoned Valorian society in ways they had not fully understood. Now they could heal properly and move forward. She told Patricia that humanity had given the galaxy a gift by refusing to stay silent. Sometimes the most important thing anyone could do was tell the truth, no matter how difficult, back on Earth. The families of the rescued children were trying to rebuild their lives. Karen Phillips watched her son Danny playing in their backyard with his younger sister. Danny still had nightmares sometimes and did not like being alone, but he was getting better. The therapist said it would take years for him to fully process the trauma, but children were resilient. Karen held on to that hope every day. She had become an advocate for other families, with lost children to trafficking or exploitation. There were support groups forming across human space, where parents could share their experiences and help each other cope. Karen spoke at schools and community centers about the warning signs of child predators. She was determined that Danny's suffering would not be meaningless. Greg Harrison, whose daughter Linda had also been rescued, started a foundation to fund research into treating trauma in children. The foundation partnered with medical institutions across Earth and the colonies. Linda herself wanted to become a therapist when she grew up, so she could help other kids who went through terrible things. She was only 12, but she was already volunteering at the support groups her father had helped create. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of Unity, Prime looking out at the vast expanse of stars. He had been asked to give a speech at a ceremony honoring those who had responded to the crisis. He had spent days trying to write something meaningful, but the words would not come. How could he explain what it felt like to see those children in cages? How could he describe the rage and determination that had driven every decision since that moment? Patricia found him standing there, asked if he was ready for the ceremony. Jake told her honestly that he did not know what to say. She smiled and told him to just speak from the heart. People did not need fancy words. They needed to know that someone cared enough to fight for what was right. Jake nodded, and together they walked toward the ceremony hall. The hall was filled with representatives from dozens of species. There were military officers and diplomats and civilians who had played roles in the crisis. The families of the rescued children sat in the front row. When Jake walked to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out at all those faces and took a deep breath. He told them that 6 months ago, he'd been doing his job when he received a distress signal. Following that signal had led to a discovery that changed everything. He talked about finding the children and seeing the fear in their eyes. He talked about the rage he felt and the determination to make things right. He said that what happened after was not about him or any individual. It was about all of humanity refusing to accept injustice. Jake spoke about the other species who had found their courage to speak up. He thanked the Valorians for breaking their silence and the Protection Council for their ongoing work. He said the galaxy was better now because people had chosen truth over comfort. But he warned that the fight was not over. There would always be those who tried to exploit the vulnerable. Eternal vigilance was required to protect the innocent. He ended by looking at the children in the front row. He told them they were the bravest people he had ever met. They had survived something no child should ever face, and they were healing. Their strength inspired everyone. He promised them and all children everywhere that humanity would never stop fighting to keep them safe, no matter what it cost. No matter who stood in the way. The room erupted in applause. Jake stepped down from the podium and walked to where the children sat. Emma ran up and hugged him, and soon all 12 children were gathered around. He knelt down and let them hug him while fighting back tears. This was why he had done it. Not